Joining us is Alyona Minkovski, host of RT's The Alyona Show. In the last 12 years, the income for the richest 400 Americans has quadrupled. Their tax rate has nearly been cut in half, but you wouldn't know that from turning on CNN. You wouldn't know it from turning on MSNBC, certainly not from turning on Fox News. Alyona, what do you think is behind the coverage we're seeing about this, the rich pay too much taxes, as it often is? Is it led by those who are funding a lot of these big media outlets, or is it actually that the big media outlets themselves are part of that list that has an interest in paying as few tax dollars as possible?
Well, I think, of course, it's all of that combined. You know, you and I have often talked about what happens when you have a corporate media structure. Obviously, that media then isn't going to report on the corporate state that this entire country has become. Obviously, MSNBC isn't going to go on and start reporting about the fact that GE paid no taxes last year, but they also recorded 77% in profits. You know, I think that you see obviously some conflicts of interest there. But, you know, one other thing that I think it is that the media just tends to focus on the political centers. They focus on Washington, D.C., they focus on New York, and they focus on what the politicians are talking about, not what's going on anywhere else. And, you know, all over America, those people are just kind of on the peripheries. And so whatever the politicians say, well, politicians are going to want to draw the least bit of attention possible to the fact now that we have the wealthiest Americans whose wealth has quadrupled, like you said, but that are paying half of that, or the fact that the largest corporations in this country are paying no taxes because the politicians are also in the, you know, pockets of these corporations. And so if the media just follows everything they say like a lapdog every day, just dissecting, you know, whatever statement a politician may have made that day and then moving on and forgetting about it, you're never really going to get to the bottom of a story.
Well, and it's interesting because there's so many distractions. So, for example, like in Wisconsin, one of the things that was going on was that those who were or are at the top of the income brackets are basically pitting middle to lower class Americans who aren't in unions against middle to lower class Americans who are in unions. And that's creating a conflict that is both, I don't see it as productive, but it's also a distraction from the fact that the rich are paying fewer and fewer taxes. So I think it's been incredibly effective to just talk about other things altogether.
Of course, it's a distraction, and that's what happens when you have, you know, a world and a media that is so focused on partisan politics, and they want to act like everything is black and white, it's right and left, and there are only two options in this world. And if that's what you do, you know, that's what Fox News, I think, also does very well, is whip people up into this frenzy. Then you constantly think that your neighbor, you know, with whom you might actually have a whole lot more in common than you think. Maybe you guys are of a different religion, but you're probably making about the same amount of money. You're probably paying about the same amount of taxes, and you're still being affected by all of the laws that are passed in this country, by the wars that we're fighting. That's where your tax dollars are going to, and yet the corporations aren't paying them. But as long as you just try to pinpoint little stories that don't focus on the big picture, like I was saying again, then it gets people whipped up into a frenzy. Then they think that they're enemies, and they can't see what they have in common, and they can't see that our entire tax system needs reform and is broken, and that, you know, democracy, quite frankly, I think, is dying when the middle class, right? The middle class is what this country is based on so much. When that class is disappearing and it's dying and Americans don't even know it because the media don't, well, I guess it's not sexy enough, right? You can't necessarily visualize it. But if you can't wake up to that, then I think this country is in trouble.
To put some numbers to this, because we haven't actually talked about them, in 1995, the richest 400 Americans paid about 30% of their income in federal taxes. In 2007, 12 years later, the richest 400 Americans paid about 16%. So it literally is almost half the tax rate. You know, something I ask myself is, sometimes media outlets have this tendency to take an issue and to put both extremes kind of up for debate and say, here's one side, here's the other side. And the reality is, with many issues, there's no necessarily need to do that. In other words, there was this study about a study that ended up being a fraud about, is the MMR vaccine connected to autism? And many media outlets went around saying, well, on one side, here's Andrew Wakefield who says it is connected, and on the other side, there's the fact that there's absolutely no evidence. There's no reason always to say both sides, all opinions are equally valid. I know it doesn't sound pretty, but I think sometimes that's the case. Is this one of those issues where the media says, well, we have to give both extremes, the rich pay too much, the rich don't pay enough? where really we need to be talking about having a different discussion altogether, maybe?
Well, I think obviously, yes, the media is always guilty, because what makes good TV is if you put two sides that are on the extremes and you pit them against each other. But I don't think that this is one of those cases. Like I was saying at first, too, I really think that this is one of the cases where the media only focuses on what's going on within Washington, within New York, within these power circles. And everything that's going on the outside, that doesn't even get touched, because there really is no extreme, I don't think you can say, when it comes to just average Americans looking at the fact that corporations and the wealthiest aren't paying their fair share of taxes. There's nothing extreme about that. It's completely normal. But you don't see media outlets going to, to North Carolina or to some small state or a small city in Ohio and talking to average Americans on the street. They're only going to focus on what the politicians will have to say. But it's interesting because we're also covering this topic on our program tonight, and there's a great video of Paul Ryan holding a town hall with his own constituents. And Paul Ryan, I think you could say in many ways, has really been embraced as this new darling here in Washington. And a lot of people have called his deficit reduction plan something that's really courageous. He's the only one that can take it on. But if you go back to that video and you watch what his constituents are saying to him, they don't understand. They don't like the fact that taxing the wealthy and raising their taxes is completely off the table. And they even started booing him. But you're never going to see that on a cable network.
That's right. And, the easiest way to get Ohio or North Carolina on TV is to either have a car chase or to have a house fire, it seems. That's the way that you get those places on TV, which is a whole other can of worms altogether. Alyona Minkovski, RT's The Alyona Show. We'll be watching tonight. Thanks so much for joining us again today.
Thanks, David. Thanks for having me on.